Judge Ward turned to Redford, her voice steady but piercing. "Mr. Redford, do you understand the charges brought against you?" Redford raised his eyes, his gaze restrained but carrying a depth, as if weighing every word. He stood, his movement slow but confident, and replied in a low, measured voice, "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the charges." The judge nodded, her face remaining impassive, and continued, "Do you plead guilty to concealing information that, as alleged by the prosecution, pertained to a government conspiracy in the 1970s? Redford paused for a moment, his fingers faintly gripping the edge of the table, and answered, "No, Your Honor, I plead not guilty." A quiet murmur rippled through the room, and the judge tapped her gavel again, demanding silence. Clayton, wasting no time, called his first witness, but Judge Ward interrupted, addressing Redford. "Mr. Redford, the prosecution alleges that in 1976, you received documents from an unnamed source tied to the FBI and chose not to share them with the press. Can you confirm or deny receiving such documents?" The room froze, all eyes fixed on Redford. He sighed, his shoulders barely slumping, and replied, "Your Honor, I received many letters and documents in those years, as an actor and as someone interested in public issues. But I do not recall any document containing information about a government conspiracy, as the prosecution describes." Clayton rose sharply, his voice louder. "Your Honor, let me clarify. Mr. Redford does not deny receiving documents but claims he doesn't remember their contents. Are we to believe a man of his stature simply forgot materials that could have exposed corruption?" Laughlin objected, his tone calm but firm. "Your Honor, my client answered clearly, and the prosecutor's speculation is not a question." Judge Ward raised a hand, halting the exchange, and turned back to Redford. "Mr. Redford, can you explain why, if such documents existed, you might have chosen not to share them with the press?" Redford paused, his gaze drifting across the room, as if searching for something in the jurors' faces, and replied, "Your Honor, in the 1970s, information could be dangerous. People who passed documents often had their own motives, and it wasn't always clear what was true or what was manipulation. If I received something that seemed questionable, I might have decided that publicizing it would cause more harm than good." The room whispered again, older spectators exchanging glances, recalling the chaos of an era when trust in government was shattered, and Clayton, sensing Redford's vague response, presented the judge with a letter, allegedly written by Redford in 1976, mentioning the danger of knowing too much. Laughlin immediately objected, stating the letter was unauthenticated, but the jury stirred, their faces showing doubt. Judge Ward examined the document closely, her fingers barely touching the paper, and asked, "Mr. Redford, do you recognize this letter?" Redford leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sheet, and replied, "Your Honor, I wrote many letters in those years, but this does not look like mine. I cannot confirm its authenticity." The tension in the room thickened, the smell of sweat mingling with the hum of fans, as reporters scribbled every word. Clayton, seizing the moment, pressed, "Your Honor, if Mr. Redford cannot disprove the letter's existence, can we trust his memory of events from 50 years ago?" Judge Ward, her expression unchanged, responded, "Counselor, the jury will evaluate the evidence. Proceed." The day ended without definitive conclusions, but with a sense that the truth lay buried in the gray zones of the past. Redford left the courtroom, his steps slow, but in his glance as he passed the swarm of reporters, there flickered a spark, not of remorse, but of quiet conviction that perhaps his silence might one day be understood. Clayton, in his impeccable gray suit, stood before the jury, holding a folder of documents, his voice booming with cold confidence. "We will show that Robert Redford did not merely remain silent. He deliberately destroyed evidence that could have exposed corruption at the highest levels of government, and that silence had consequences for our democracy." Redford's defense attorney, Henry Laughlin, with gray hair and a worn briefcase, sat beside him, his glasses slipping down his nose as he took notes, his calm demeanor contrasting with Clayton's aggressive energy. Judge Ward, with her stern but fair expression, struck her gavel, calling for order as the whispers in the room grew louder after the prosecutor's words. She turned to Redford, her voice clear and formal. "Mr. Redford, yesterday you stated that you do not recall receiving documents related to a government conspiracy. Today, the prosecution has presented a letter they claim was written by you. Can you explain whether you ever wrote anything that might suggest your awareness of such documents? Redford rose slowly, his movements deliberate, a shadow of anxiety flickering in his eyes, and replied, Your Honor, I wrote many letters in the 1970s, often at the request of friends or colleagues, but I do not recall writing anything about concealing documents or a conspiracy. If this letter is genuine, it may have been taken out of context. Clayton reacted instantly, his voice sharper. Your Honor, let me clarify. Mr. Redford does not deny the possibility of writing the letter, but again cites memory issues. Are we to believe a man with such a career and attention to detail simply forgot such significant actions? Laughlin rose, his tone calm but firm. Your Honor, the prosecution relies on an unverified document and attempts to interpret my client's words as an admission of guilt. This is speculation, not evidence. Judge Ward raised a hand, halting the dispute, and addressed Redford. Mr. Redford, the prosecution alleges you met with an unnamed informant in New York in 1976. Can you confirm or deny such a meeting? The room stilled, reporters stopped writing, and even the fans seemed to hum more quietly. Redford sighed, his gaze briefly resting on the jury, 12 faces holding his fate, and replied, Your Honor, I met many people in those years, including journalists, activists, and even government officials, due to my work in film and interest in politics. But I do not recall a specific meeting where I was given documents related to a conspiracy. Clayton, sensing weakness, called a witness. Richard Kelly, a former FBI assistant in his 70s, with trembling hands and a raspy voice. Kelly, nervously adjusting his tie, testified that in 1976, he saw Redford receive a folder in a Manhattan restaurant and heard him say, This cannot be made public, it's too dangerous. Laughlin immediately began cross-examination, his questions precise as surgical cuts. Mr. Kelly, you claim to have heard these words across a crowded restaurant 50 years later with no records or other witnesses to corroborate? Kelly faltered, his gaze wandering, admitting he couldn't recall all details precisely. But the damage was done. The jury exchanged glances, their faces showing doubt, and older spectators whispered, recalling Watergate and rumors of secret deals. Clayton, sensing an advantage, presented another piece of evidence, a photograph dated 1976, showing Redford outside a restaurant holding a folder. Laughlin objected, noting it could be any document, but the jury buzzed and the tension in the room peaked. Judge Ward, noticing the unrest, addressed Redford. Mr. Redford, if you received documents you deemed dangerous, can you explain why you did not turn them over to authorities or the press, but, as the prosecution alleges, destroyed them? Redford paused, his fingers tightening on the pen, and replied, his voice quiet but clear, Your Honor, in the 1970s, truth was slippery. I saw how information was used to manipulate, how people lost careers or even lives due to careless handling of rumors. If I received something that seemed unreliable, I might have decided destruction was the only way to protect those who could be implicated. The room fell silent, but Clayton seized the moment, his voice almost triumphant. Your Honor, this is practically an admission. Mr. Redford acknowledges he may have destroyed documents, placing himself above the law. Laughlin objected, but the jury now looked at Redford with renewed doubt, and even his elderly fans in the gallery began whispering, wondering if they had misjudged their hero. Judge Ward announced a recess, her gavel striking loudly, but the tension lingered. Redford remained seated, his gaze fixed on the table, yet a spark flickered in his eyes. Not of fear, but of quiet hope that perhaps his motives might one day be understood, even if the verdict was harsh. Judge Ward struck her gavel, calling for silence, her voice firm and formal cutting through the hum. Mr. Redford, the prosecution has presented evidence, including a letter and testimony, suggesting your involvement in concealing information. This is your final opportunity to provide an explanation or evidence that could alter the course of this case. If you fail to offer compelling arguments, I will have no choice but to send the matter to the jury, and given the severity of the charges, a conviction could carry a sentence of up to 2 years in prison. Do you have anything to add? The room stilled, the air heavy, all eyes turning to Redford. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, a spark, not of panic, but of deep contemplation, flashing in his eyes. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but clear. Your Honor, I have always tried to act according to my principles. In the 1970s, I saw how truth could be a weapon, and how it could destroy the innocent if mishandled. If I received documents, I do not recall them containing anything that could expose a conspiracy. I did not destroy the truth. I tried to protect those who might have been harmed by chaos. Clayton, sensing weakness, interjected sharply. Your Honor, this is yet another attempt to evade responsibility. Mr. Redford cannot refute the letter or the testimony. Laughlin objected, but Judge Ward raised a hand, her gaze stern. Counselor, I have heard the defendant. Do you have additional evidence? Clayton opened his mouth, but at that moment, the courtroom doors creaked and all heads turned. An elderly woman entered, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her gait slow but resolute, clutching a small folder, her hands trembling with age but her eyes burning with certainty. Judge Ward frowned. State your name and purpose. The woman, her voice raspy but firm, replied, My name is Eleanor Marshall, and I was a secretary at a New York law firm in 1976. I was present at a meeting where Mr. Redford was given documents. The room buzzed, reporters stirred, and Clayton looked thrown. Laughlin quickly rose. Your Honor, we request permission for Ms. Marshall to testify. Judge Ward nodded, and Eleanor, approaching the witness stand, took the oath. She spoke, her words falling like stones into still water. I worked for a firm advising government officials. In 1976, I saw Mr. Redford receive a folder, but it wasn't about a conspiracy. It contained draft scripts for a film tied to political events and a letter asking him to keep them confidential because they included sensitive details that could offend certain individuals. I heard Mr. Redford say he didn't want these materials to cause trouble, and he returned them to the sender. Laughlin promptly requested to examine the folder Eleanor brought. It contained old, yellowed pages, script drafts, and a letter signed not by Redford but by a producer requesting confidentiality. Clayton, furious, argued it didn't disprove other evidence, but the jury was already exchanging glances, their faces showing doubt. Judge Ward, closely inspecting the documents, turned to Redford. Mr. Redford, do you corroborate Ms. Marshall's account? Redford, his eyes now glinting with quiet relief, replied, Your Honor, I didn't recall the specifics, but this sounds plausible. I often received materials for films, and I always tried to act cautiously to avoid harming anyone. Clayton pressed on, but his voice lost strength as the jury whispered. Judge Ward announced the case would go to the jury but added, The new testimony requires careful consideration. I urge the jury to weigh all evidence without bias. The room erupted in murmurs as Redford sat, his shoulders slightly straighter, a flicker of hope in his gaze. Not for full exoneration, but that the truth, however complex, might find its way. He left the courtroom, ignoring the flash of cameras with a sense that perhaps his silence would not be a burden forever. Comment. Will Redford come out clean? The emergence of Eleanor Marshall's testimony and the documents she provided cast significant doubt on the prosecution's case, suggesting that the folder Redford received in 1976 was related to a film project rather than a government conspiracy. This new evidence, combined with the unreliability of the prosecution's letter and the shaky testimony of Richard Kelly, weakens Clayton's argument substantially. Redford's measured responses, emphasizing the chaotic and manipulative nature of information in the 1970s, resonate with the jury, particularly the older members who remember the Watergate era's complexities. While Clayton's aggressive push for a conviction keeps the threat of a 2-year sentence alive, the jury's visible doubt and Judge Ward's call for an unbiased evaluation tilt the scales in Redford's favor. It's likely that the jury, after deliberating, will find reasonable doubt, potentially leading to an acquittal. However, the open-ended nature of the case leaves room for uncertainty. Redford may avoid prison, but his reputation might remain tarnished in the eyes of some, leaving him to carry the weight of public scrutiny. His quiet hope as he leaves the courtroom suggests he believes the truth, though complex, may ultimately set him free, even if not entirely unscathed.